So today we are very happy to have our professor Hans Hugo here, the professor from Berlin School of Economics and Law, and to our very existing topics, the role of wages in the economic development. And as our regular routine of the workshop, I summarize some of the questions from the participants under our discussions under your video lecture. And please allow me to first ask the first question. And after that, Professor He, you could have 5 minutes to give the first response. And after that, we open the floor for questions. So the first question is, some participants have concerns about whether the government could maintain a balanced budget as an important function in income distribution. So to what extent does the government spending or surplus or deficits impact on the income distribution as well as the aggregate demand? Yes, Professor, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. First, thank you for inviting me for this workshop. And this is actually a very complex complex question. So government policy and budget deficits. First, let me say the usual approaches analyzing government activities to distinguish 3 dimensions. First, the government can stabilize aggregate demand, and in this way also stabilize employment or stimulate production, and in that way stimulate employment. The second big function is that government can heavily influence income distribution, also wealth distribution. So this is a second important function. And the third big function is the government intervenes into the structure of the economy. It influences allocation of resources, if you like, by providing infrastructure, also by providing public goods like education. And I think in all 3 dimensions, distribution plays a certain role. Of course, the direct link between government activities and income distribution, if you take income distribution, is the tax system. That's obvious. The tax system directly influences income distribution. Which groups in society pay taxes? Are the rich taxed? Are there loopholes in the tax system? But also in the expenditure side, of course, we have big distributional effects. For example, transfers to poor households, and also supporting certain industry. This all has distributional effects. And then what you also have asked, the budget deficits and budget surpluses. This also has indirectly distributional effects. First, let me argue that a balanced budget is actually not needed. I think some countries follow such a strategy that public expenditures and revenues should be completely balanced over the cycle. I think this is not necessary. The government can have a budget deficit, even permanently. I think what is important, public debt should not increase permanently. And especially for countries in the global south, increasing public debt would be destabilizing. And budget deficits are an instrument to stabilize aggregate demand. So if the government have bigger budget deficits, the government stabilizes aggregate demand. This has also distributional effects because it creates employment, reduces unemployment. And yeah, maybe I stop here and wait what kind of more questions come in this area.
Yes, thanks very much, Professor. Very brave and clear answers. So now we're also open for the floor, since we have few people here. So please be open, be free to interact. And if for us to revealing the course, maybe I could follow up. No, Indira, please.
Hans-Jörg, can you tell us a bit, how does this increasing public deficit over a long time, particularly for countries in the South, has a disruptive effect? So what are the implications of that in the long run? And I'm asking because in my own country, Albania, it has reached really scary levels of over 80%. So I want to know what are kind of the risks that countries are faced with when going that path.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. So let me first make clear in the global north, in developed countries like European Monetary Union or in United States, there's a huge freedom for fiscal expansion. That means you have seen during the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, 2009, and also during the COVID crisis, you have seen huge budget deficits reaching 10% or more of GDP, of gross domestic product. So in these countries, you can have, at least for short and medium periods, huge budget deficits, and this is important to stabilize aggregate demand and to stabilize the whole economy. This is very much different in countries like Albania or in many countries in the global south. Why is this the case? Usually big budget deficits have to be financed with the support of central banks. That means central banks are refinancing banks, and the banks buy government bonds, for example. So, for example, take the European Monetary Union, 40% of public debt is held by the European Central Bank in the European Monetary Union. So that's a big part. Yeah. So as a rule, big budget deficits are linked to increasing money supply, to increasing monetary wealth in the country. And here the problem starts for the typical country in the global south. This additional monetary wealth is exchanged in foreign currency, and you get pressure on the exchange rate. If you have strong pressure on the exchange rate, that means strong depreciation, you have an inflationary push. And so you have the link between high budget deficits, capital outflows, depreciation, inflation. And then the countries quickly have to stop to have budget deficits financed by the central bank. So they are very much restricted. And there is one option, it's a kind of, you could even call it kind of sweet poison, yeah? The countries can go abroad to take credit in foreign currency to finance the budget deficit. Then they accumulate foreign debt. And this is then, as you have mentioned, very dangerous, because a high level of foreign debt is dangerous because if, let's say, if you have a depreciation, it's difficult for the government to pay back the debt, or refinancing may not be possible because confidence in the country may break down and there is no capital inflows to refinance the debt, etc. Then it becomes very, very, very risky. And in many countries in the global south, including Albania, for example, The government has accumulated high foreign debt and is now very dependent on foreign currencies. And this is, of course, a very unstable and situation which is not very good. And you could argue, why do not domestic wealth owners, which households finance the budget? Why has the government in these countries go to the central bank or to foreign creditors? The problem is the wealth owners in these countries only to a very limited extent are prepared to finance the government, and there's not enough domestic monetary wealth, existing monetary wealth in the country to finance big budget deficits. So there are only the two options: central bank or foreign refinancing, and both has limitations and bad effects for developing countries.
Yes, thanks very much, Professor. I feel really privileged here because we have not many participants, so I can ask, also following some of my personal questions as well. I think you mentioned two things. It's really like I concerned. One thing is it's about this debt structure. Ne? As we see, the debt could be also dependent, especially as you mentioned, the foreign debt for developing countries would be very dangerous. And that's exactly the argument in many years was in China was circulating about Japan have a huge debt. But the point is we ignore the fact actually Japan have the debt that huge, more than I think sometimes 200% of the 2 times of the GDP. It was because they actually have internal debt. They don't have a very strong foreign debt, and they also have a developed economies. So I think that point maybe you could also add a little bit. From another point of view, as you mentioned in the last of your comment about whether why the developing countries depending so much on central bank or foreign debt to finance. One of the arguments was also very interesting in China was talking about because China now we have a high propensity for savings. So in a certain sense, many economists was claimed China could have a very fast or stable capital accumulation was because of the internal savings. So I would also like to listen to your opinion on this argument. Also, allow me to ask a question for Kevin, because Kevin said he's in a noisy environment. So his question is, how can the pandemic treaty evaluate wage development in the global south? Yeah. So please.
Which treaty?
Yeah, so he's like more specific, like can the pandemic treat evaluate and improve wage development in the global south? What are the key indicators? And I think it is not about treaty, maybe it was wrong.
I still do not really understand the question. What it's a wage development during COVID or?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Kevin, maybe you could try, let's say if it work, because I also not understand this pandemic treaty. Kevin, please.
Yeah, Prof. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a proposed pandemic treaty about to be signed, I think, by the WHO. So I think it's ongoing, but I'm just asking the question, do you think it could evaluate wage development in the global south, looking at what indicators are they going to be looking at? So I don't know if you are aware of the treaty.
Actually, I can't understand the question.
Yeah, maybe I think I'm sorry, Kevin, but I also am not really sure about this pandemic treaty by what you mentioned at WHO. But maybe I think your question is more look at how the pandemic evaluates and on the impact of the wage in the global south. Maybe Professor did this question. Yeah. Indira, do you want?
Well, I heard Kevin to have said that there is a pandemic treaty that the WHO is working on, and he does not know if you have heard about it, but he's thinking, how will that impact? Thank you.
Could you explain this treaty?
Perhaps in the chat box, because I think, Kelvin, I think your connection was also not very good. So if you can type it in the chat box, what's the treaty? I think that would be helpful because not everybody is aware. And Hans-Jörg, just a very small question on my previous question. What would be considered a dangerous foreign debt for a country? So is there some sort of a sense of what's the threshold? If you go beyond that, you're really in troubles.
Yeah. Okay. Now we have several questions. First to answer Edlira's question, there's no clear threshold. That's a problem. Yeah. It always depends on the historical situation. You can only argue the higher the foreign debt in relation to GDP, the more fragile the situation becomes, the more unstable the situation becomes. And you know, in Europe, European Monetary Union, it is argued public debt to GDP should be 60%. But there's no good theoretical justification for the 60%. But definitely, if you reach 70, 80, 90% public debt of GDP, it becomes dangerous. The situation becomes fragile. But there's no scientific justification to just give a certain percentage. And also to support Cheng in Japan, public debt is over 200% of GDP. But this is not a problem. It's completely domestic public debt, and the Japanese accept the Japanese yen as a currency. That if the monetary wealth increases, they do not shift monetary wealth in foreign currencies. So the external value of the Japanese yen stays stable in spite of huge public debt. And this is exactly the difference in many developing countries. If public debt becomes higher and higher, capital is transferred to foreign currency and you have depreciation. And I think this is also the big difference to China. China has relatively low level of public debt, but it has a lot of private debt, etc. But the key point is China has capital controls, and if a country can implement capital controls, of course, the room to increase domestic debt, also public debt, increases. And it's correct, savings in China are very, very high. But my argument would be that the savings are the result of investment. So I think my interpretation of the Chinese miracle is that the very, very high investment dynamic leads to high savings. And so it's not that the other way around, so that you could argue, please save a lot, and then you have a positive development. It's just the other way around, stimulate investment, and then you will create savings as a result. Let me come to, if I understand this question correct, wages and during the COVID-19 crisis. And maybe then the question could be made more clear, as I could not really completely understand. What is important during COVID crisis, when we look at wages, is that even if a country is affected by a big crisis, and let's say unemployment is increasing, and you have big problems in the labor market, what never should happen, that wages are cut, that wages are reduced. Because there's, in some countries, there's a tendency, if you have a real employment problem, etc., it is argued now we have to save the economy, cut wages. This is a completely wrong policy. From the microeconomic perspective, this may make sense. You know, as a firm, you look as a firm, you have problems. If you cut wages, that is fine. But if all firms cut wages, you create deflation. And deflation is very, very dangerous, because deflation leads automatically to a big financial crisis, because everybody indebted in domestic currency will be confronted with a higher real debt, because deflation increases the real debt and then really leads to big economic problems. We know that from the 1930s, the Great Depression, when we had cut in wages, deflation, that falling prices, and then increasing real debt, and then big financial problems. So I think when we speak about wages, it should always be clear for the wage level. For the wage level, it's very important that the wage level increases according to productivity development in the economy, plus a low inflation rate. So wages never should be cut, even in the deepest crisis. Not. But I still did not really understand the question, and probably I don't know much about this treaty.
Yes, Professor. I think, especially as George mentioned, I think the treaty was not yet passed. It was more talked in the WHO, and I think the treaty is more urged the member states of WHO to increase the political commitment to the health governance, and maybe on the human rights as well. Yes, please, Benji.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Cheng. Hans, my question is about the possibility of an economy characterized by high wages and generous public budgets for underdeveloped countries. I'm thinking, can it be argued that in conditions of low to middle income countries, that such high wages and public expenditures are structurally constrained, or if not these low incomes, that conditions of dependency or neocolonialism that also presents like structural limits to such a model of high wages and generous budgets.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think we should be clear that an increase in real wages, so the level of real wages in the medium and long term, is only possible if the country is able to increase productivity. There is no other way. So that means trade unions should really also push productivity developments, of course, in a social way. But the only possibility to increase real wages is to increase productivity. And then Benjamin, of course, there are a lot of problems for catching up. That would be a whole lecture. It is very difficult for developing countries to catch up. For example, there is a big hope that foreign direct investment would trigger technological development, would help the countries to catch up. But even foreign direct investment only to a limited extent transfers technology. I've just finished a research project analyzing this, and it becomes clear that when we take foreign direct investment, for example, the lead firm in a global value chain may help to produce a better quality product. Yeah, the lead firm may also help to use a better technology to produce a simple product, but the lead firm never will transfer key competences, newest technologies to the developing country. So that means the only possibility really to catch up is to have a national project of industrial policy to partly using the help from foreign countries and foreign direct investment, but a key project to catch up must be a national project of industrial policy. And here we can learn from China. China is an excellent example of good industrial policy, but we also can learn from early South Korea, or we can learn from Sweden after World War II, etc. But catching up must be triggered in developing countries by industrial policy to push productivity. And then let me add one more argument. Countries can, over a short and medium period, increase real wages by having an overvalued exchange rate. That means an overvalued exchange rate, you have current account deficits. And this allows to increase the living standard and also the real wages. However, such a strategy to increase the living standard via an overvalued exchange rate is dangerous because it leads to foreign debt. If you have a current account deficit, you accumulate foreign debt. That's as dangerous as public debt in foreign currency. And second, it reduces domestic demand. Yeah, it reduces domestic demand and is not supporting employment. So in my opinion, the best long-term strategy for a country is to have a balanced current account, not a deficit, push up productivity, and wage development should, the wage level should be linked to productivity development. Let me add to this WTO treaty. I think maybe this is the point. There's a debate in WTO, but there's also the debate in Western countries, in Europe, for example, and also the United States, that the patent law should be not as strict as it is. Because especially to produce medicine or whatever what you need to fight against the COVID crisis, it is argued by some developed countries, unfortunately not by Germany, that developing countries should get patents to produce whatever they need, and that this is allowed. But so far, as I know, the multinational companies having the patents do not agree to this. And of course, it would be very, very urgent to allow countries to produce everything what they need against the COVID-19 crisis. And in my opinion, it is a scandal that the multinational companies have the patents and don't transfer them the right to produce whatever is needed to developing countries. So this is in the debate, but unfortunately not solved until today.
Yes, thanks very much, and very thanks to Benji as well to mention these questions. And also let me remind all of us here, we also have another course, Regular Global Supply Chains, and Professor Hans was also have 2 video lectures on this catching up One is about economic clusters and the role of governments. The other one is about macro management of industrial policy, as Professor already mentioned here. So if you are interested in this question on the industrialization, you could go back to that lecture. Yes, now allow me to ask the second question from our discussions. So some participants mentioned the potential of the universal basic income to reduce the income inequality. So what are the possible impacts if they implement universal basic income to the aggregate demand or consumption demand in the macroeconomic context? Yeah, Professor.
Okay, thank you. Also a very good question. And yeah, actually, there's an intensive debate about universal basic income. And before I discuss these questions, I would make one argument. Of course, if you redistribute from the rich to the poor, this has a positive effect for GDP growth. Because if you transfer income from the rich to the poor will have a higher propensity to consume. So aggregate consumption demand will go up, and a higher demand will stimulate production and employment. There's a lot of research, even by the International Monetary Fund, with a key argument: if income inequality is too high, development becomes very, very difficult. And it's not only the demand side, which is important. It is also the reproduction of labor, if you like. So if you transfer income to poorer households, this allows a better education, better health, etc., better recreation. So it is clear, if inequality is too high, development becomes very, very difficult. Now, universal basic income could be one instrument to organize such a redistribution. And that's possible. However, when we start about thinking about universal basic income, we immediately have to answer the question: what should be the level of this basic income? Yeah, that's a problem. Let's take Germany. In Germany, we have a basic income, as in many developed countries. But it's not universal. You know, in Germany, if you have no job, if you have no assets, or only small stock of assets, you get government money, government transfers, but you have to show that you have no job, and you have to show that you have not a big bank account or own a house. If you own a house, you have first to sell your house, and if you use that up, then the government will help you. So we have this transfer, this basic transfer, so that everybody can survive, but there's a basket of goods, and this very basic is not luxurious, and so we have this system. If you want to have a luxurious universal basic income, you have to ask who has to pay it. And in my judgment, it is theoretically possible to have a relatively luxurious universal basic income. Everybody gets it. However, I cannot see any country in the world where this is politically feasible, because this luxurious universal basic income implies that the working part of population really has to share a big part of their income with the population getting this universal basic income. So when you demand universal basic income in a luxurious way, you have to find the political support that the rest of society is prepared to pay for that. So in my opinion, what makes more sense is to have a basic income, not universal, to give it to the poor people, and then have a minimum wage which allows substantially higher income. So if you work, so I think it's also in most countries a part of fairness. If you work and you have the minimum wage, your income should be at least a little bit higher than if you don't work and you get your basic income. Of course, this basic income should allow a decent life, and it should be paid to the poor households, etc. I think in this direction, this is politically more feasible in most countries as a luxurious universal basic income. But it's hotly debated, and it's a question what kind of political powers you have in the countries, whether you can realize it or not. Yeah.
Yes, thanks very much. Now we are open the floor for the questions. Please feel free. Yes, Aisha, please.
Thanks, Hans-Jörg. In your video lecture, you mentioned that unemployment is a key or usual state of a capitalist economy. So I was wondering, what are some of the implications of this for developing countries that may not even be able to have this basic income transfers for their societies? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is correct. Let's explain it in the following way. Basically, the investment dynamic, also depending on income distribution, the consumption dynamic, these are the key drivers of economic growth. Of course, we have also government demand and external demand, but consumption demand is the most important demand. And consumption demand, again, depends very much on investment demand. So we have a demand dynamic depending on many factors, income distribution, monetary policy, whatever, expectations, and the outcome is a certain GDP. And a certain GDP, given the technology, leads to a certain employment. And the problem is this employment must not be full employment. So there's no mechanism in a capitalist economy which leads to full employment. There's a mechanism which leads to a certain GDP. Given the technology, you have a certain employment, but you still can have a big part of society which is unemployed. Especially in developing countries, the problem exists that the capitalist part of the economy is relatively small, and you have a kind of dual economy, and you have a big part of the economy which is linked to the capitalist economy, but it is, so to say, completely underdeveloped. And you have a huge surplus of labor. And then you have, you could argue, it is extremely difficult to create such a dynamic that full employment can be created. What is the conclusion of this? There are different answers possible. The first answer is you need government intervention, macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy to stabilize aggregate demand, for example, by having a change in income distribution. So the government can try to stabilize aggregate demand, stabilize employment, and stimulate demand. And in this way, try to create high employment. However, these policies which are now used in most countries are not strong enough to guarantee full employment. And when we go back to John Maynard Keynes, very famous economist in the 1930s, they are creating the first big models about macroeconomics. And he argued we have to socialize investment. This is, of course, a very radical demand, but he argued the investment dynamic cannot be left to private hands. We need heavy government interventions to stimulate investment. Of course, still in the small or medium-sized companies, we can have a lot of private investment, but for the big companies, we should have state-controlled investment. We should have high government investment, also in infrastructure. And if we have this politically driven investment dynamic, then we have also a relatively stable overall economic development, which leads to high employment. And again, we can take China as an example. I think until today, the investment dynamic in China is very much dependent on the government. The big companies are state-owned or partly also private-owned, but still the government can influence overall investment dynamic. The banking system is almost 100% state-owned in China. So there are a lot of instruments to control investment. And in many countries which were successful, we have in different ways heavy influences by government to stimulate investment. That you could argue this is a state type of capitalist system, but I think it is able to stabilize investment. So to sum up your question, it is really the case the capitalist system does only by chance lead to full employment, and the needed instrument, if you really want to have full employment for a long period of time, is really heavy government interventions to control aggregate demand, especially investment demand, because investment demand is the very unstable demand. But of course, in addition, you need a relatively equal income distribution to have sufficient consumption demand, etc. So only a kind of heavily regulated type of capitalism is able to create full employment permanently, so to speak.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Indira.
Okay, sorry, George. It shouldn't be my questions, but just on the universal basic income, Hans-Jörg, you made reference a couple of times on luxurious UBI, and I wanted to know, what do you mean by luxurious? So I understand when you are not for a universal basic income, you are for rather targeted basic income, right? So just for the poor. So that's one part of the response. The other part is you're using the term luxurious, and I wanted to kind of understand what you mean by that, because I would understand that also the kind of social protection schemes that we have in our countries, in which people are paid pennies basically, that it's really at the level of the most basic survival, even below that one, that does not allow for any sort of decent living. And I think that's the argument they're making, that they're saying, oh, but you can't be paid much because otherwise you don't have an incentive to actually work. But does that make sense to be at such low levels? So should we instead speaking of some sort of income that allows for decent living? And then on this investment demand from the government, is there a need to qualify there? What do we mean? Like, what kind of investments are we talking about? Like right now in Albania, the government is investing in some sort of infrastructure that actually just facilitates the tourism for the very rich. So I just wonder whether there is a need to qualify when we speak about government investment, what kind of investment we're talking about. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, okay, thank you for.
Can we collect the question from George, and then because we only have 10 minutes now. George, please.
Okay, thank you. So, well, mine is a little confusion, but first I want to, commend Professor for this, presentation, because as he was speaking, I started to get the clear understanding of how austerity measures in third world countries like in Liberia, where I come from, is having an impact and is in a negative direction. But then when we talk about, because you see, they'll talk about having a development policy plan that will drive this issue of wage improvement and improving livelihood. But when you follow up what we see in our own countries, like in Liberia, where IMF and OEB are imposing these austerity measures, it is all about cutting wage bill. But you don't see any development going on. It's more or less like promoting how Federal Reserve is increased. If you understand what I'm trying to drive at, because they tell you don't spend so much do not employ, you cannot spend more on education or on health and those kinds of things. But then where I have a confusion is, given that unions have to advocate for better wage, let's say living wage for their workers. If we don't have, we are not supposed to call for salary cuts, wages should not be reduced, but at the same time, we don't see any development, and this is where we have the issue in our countries, where you have salary disparity. How can we advocate for a better living wage when the 1% that makes so much, we cannot ask for their salaries to be reduced, and yet we need to advocate for the workers who are below the line, salaries to be improved, because that is the only chain that we can see in between there. By reducing theirs, when we're talking about redistribution, how can we advocate for that? That is why I have a confusion there. Thank you very much.
Yes, I would also like to use this opportunity to ask a question as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, Professor. So when you mentioned that the basic universal basic income, it's like by which level is a question. I'm wondering, that is a question of technical issue or that is a question of theoretical issue? And because I also have a little bit of confusion, as also Indira mentioned, because in many countries we have the social protection schemes. We also have the minimum wage schemes. And in these cases, I'm also wondering what are the impact of the universal basic income in relation to what we often talk about, the wage determined by the collective bargaining, because that have a very dynamic structure of the wage, which does not really at the same time leading to the inflations. But now if we're thinking to implement universal basic income for the same level for everyone, related to the dynamics of wage structures, and I have more doubt on that as well. Yes, no, it's your time, Professor.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with basic income, yeah, universal income. What is the luxurious? income. So, for example, in Germany, you find debates, and also I think not only in Germany, you find debates that the basic income has a level of, let's say, of medium skilled worker. So let's say that the basic income, universal income demanded is much higher than what unskilled worker is earning today. And of course, if you let's make an extreme example. If you demand a luxurious universal basic income, which is according to the wage of a skilled worker to have a nice life, yeah, so to say, then immediately the question is, how can this be financed? Then how this can be financed? And the idea is, the most radical idea, in my opinion, is that everybody gets it. Let's say income at the level of a skilled worker, and you decide whether you go to work or not. Yeah, but you get that income unconditional, and if you have this level, this really relatively high level of income, I cannot see any society which would accept such a radical redistribution. So I'm very much in favor of income to people who need it, and this could be relatively luxurious. I mean, it should be allow a decent life, but it should be focused on really on the poor, and not everybody should get it. And I also think there should be a certain difference between when you go working and when you go not working. I think that's, at least in my opinion, a part of fairness. So the minimum wage, which also guarantees a minimum income, the minimum wage when you work, the minimum wage should be a little bit higher than the basic income if you don't work. But these are questions of justice. These are not technical questions, these are questions how societies feel, what kind of income distribution they like, and what kind of redistribution they accept. So it's a political decision, you could argue an economist cannot tell too much about it, because a society has to decide, and then it can be realized. This leads me to the question by George. If I understood it correctly, wage dispersion is probably extremely high in your country, and actually wage dispersion is typically high in developing countries. And let me stress, wage dispersion is in almost all countries the most important factor for inequality. It's not the distribution between profit and wages. It's not government policies. It is wage dispersion, which is really creating huge inequalities, especially in developing countries. And I think a key policy also for development should be to reduce wage dispersion. But this implies, of course, solidarity among the working class, what is difficult to organize. But I think as trade unions or trade union leaders, this has to be discussed. It has to be made clear that wage dispersion is not acceptable, and that probably over a long period of time, the low wage earners should have higher wage increases than the top earners. We also have the problem in Germany in the 70s and 80s. It was very much pushed by trade unions that wage increases should not be a percentage, it should be a fixed sum. Yeah, all workers should get, let's say, 100 euros more plus 2% or so. That was the strategy. I think this is overall a good strategy to have, let's say, partly a percentage, small, but then have a fixed increase for all workers at all levels. That this could be a strategy to reduce wage dispersion. Then come to the question about investment demand. That's also very, very important question, discussing that you need, as Keynes called it, socialization of investment. This includes, in my opinion, that all stakeholders in society should be involved in deciding about investment. We don't discuss industrial policy here, but we can transfer the debate. In industrial policy, it's very important that trade unions take part in the definition of industrial policy. And I think also when we speak about the investment dynamic in general in the country, controlled by government, let's say we have such a society, then of course this should not be decided by bureaucrats, it should not be decided by managers. You should include here trade unions, and it should be a kind of democratic structure in which direction investment should be go. And especially if you need the transition for sustainable ecological economy, you need anyway heavy government interventions. So I think trade unions should play a key role also in deciding in which direction investment should go, if you have such a comprehensive model where the government has really a lot of influence how investment is organized.
Yes, thanks so much. It's a really lovely debate and very interactive. Again, allow me to thank Professor Herr, as also my supervisor. As an economist, always very clear, precise, direct to the point, and your articles always understandable by everyone. Thanks so much for your contribution.
Yeah.
And I also like to thank everyone for participating in today's workshop.